Hello, and welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your special co-host, Michael R.G. Connolly. Firstly, I want to thank the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era for working with Michael Cullinay and myself to create and sponsor this position. The Society is the primary professional association for historians of the era, and I'm sincerely grateful to be the graduate student representative for the Society. In addition to events and opportunities for scholars and emerging scholars, Shigate publishes an exceptional journal called the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. If you like this show, you'll love the journal, and you might want to consider joining the Society, particularly if you are a graduate or an undergraduate student. You can find out more at shigate.org. Ever since Frederick Jackson Turner's 1893 Frontier Thesis claimed that the settlement of the West was instrumental in the formation of American identity, the Old West has caught the imagination of Americans and tourists. Dime novels, movies, TV shows, and video games have all played their part to cement the image of a desolate, lawless land in the minds of many. Cities like Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, and dude ranches across the western states have similarly played up this stereotype in order to cash in on the myth. Red Dead Redemption 2, a video game released by Rockstar Games in 2018, is only one of the most recent examples of the frontier west in popular culture. Set in 1899, the game follows a group of American outlaws on the run after a botched heist. But it's more than just a regular shoot-'em-up Western-style video game. Although set in a fictionalized version of turn-of-the-century United States, the game is peppered with American history, including the Indian Wars, Pinkertons, the Lost Cause, and suffrage, all of which is detailed in Tori C. Olsson's new book, Red Dead's History, a video game, an obsession, and America's violent past. Tori is a associate professor in American history at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and the author of Agrarian Crossing, Reformers and the Remaking of the U.S. and Mexican Countryside, which won 5 awards, including the Bernath Book Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, the Tomasini Book Award from the Latin American Studies Association, and the Saludos Book Prize from the Agricultural History Society. Welcome to the show, Tori.
Thanks so much, Michael. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here with you.
I'm so glad that you came and agreed to the show. So, firstly, I do have a bone to pick with you because before picking up your book, I had never played Red Dead Redemption in any form. My brother played it when it first came out, so I was somewhat familiar with it, but I never played a minute of it. But since reading your book, I have clocked dozens of hours playing this game, if not more, probably more. Why did you pick up the game, and how did you get the idea of using it to teach American history?
Yeah, well, that's pretty funny to hear. So yeah, it's a very strange story, and if you told me 5 years ago that I would write my second book about a video game, I would probably have laughed at you. So these things are all very unpredictable. All of this does come out of a bit of my own personal history, which is that in the 1990s, when I was in high school, I was an inveterate video gamer. I just really, really loved playing games on my PC, especially in the late 90s. And that was a period when uh, PC gaming was undergoing a sort of golden age, when lots of franchises that people are still playing sequels of, today were coming out. So I was obsessed. I was addicted. But it was not good for me. It did not do me any favors either socially or academically. And I will confess, I squeaked out of high school with a 2.7 GPA, due primarily to the fact that I was playing Half-Life instead of studying for my exams. So I realized, I was lucky enough to get into college, but once I got there, and once I began loving the classes, especially the history classes that I was taking, I realized I had to quit video gaming. So I did. I don't know how I did it, but I went cold turkey, and I just decided that this wasn't good for me, and I decided this was like sort of a childish obsession. I needed to mature out of it and move onward. So by the time that I, got pledged my history major and got deep into classes, I'd quit video gaming and moved on to other things. And it turns out that I stayed true to that promise to give up video games for a really long time, like 20 years. Because for the next 2 decades, I really had turned my back on that world. I went to graduate school, earned my master's and PhD, and then started work as an assistant professor at University of Tennessee, where I still teach. And all throughout, I really didn't have any time to delve into any hobbies aside from, just exercise and staying alive and this sort of stuff. So I assumed, that video gaming was something that was part of my past, maybe a shameful, regrettable part of my past, even. And indeed, it's very possible that my life could have continued on that trajectory, but the reason things changed was that strange phenomenon known as the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as every listener can remember, upset and turned upside down their lives in such unpredictable ways. And for me, it gave me the opportunity to kind of listen to that little devil on my shoulder who had been whispering for the last few years, I bet video games look really good now. I bet they're really interesting. You should play them, right? So like by 2020, it was a perfect moment because I was, confined within my home during lockdowns. By that point, I had tenure. My first book was done. I was fairly established in my professional career. So I gave in to that little devil on my shoulder and I said, okay, let's do this. So I bought a new gaming PC early in the pandemic. And, I was anxious. I was like, wow, what if this impacts my professional career in some way? And I only imagined that it could have a negative impact. I could never have imagined that it might have something of a positive impact. Well, we'll see what happens with this book, but so far it's been a lot of fun. Either way, so I get this gaming PC, right? It's like March, April 2020. And one of the very first games that I pick up is Red Dead Redemption 2. And I picked it up mainly because I heard it had really good graphics. It really wasn't the historical nature of it that drew me in, though I did have a colleague of mine who's a historian of the Civil War era. He had played it previously before the pandemic, and he told me, hey, Tori, this game is not stupid, right? Which is like really high praise coming from a professional historian. So I thought, okay, I knew the game was set in 1899, I came for the graphics. I stayed for the history. But again, I picked it up just as a hobby. It was for fun. But, about 20 hours into the storyline of this game, and the game, as listeners may or may not know, it's set in this fictionalized America of 1899. It follows this outlaw gang as they flee from authority across much of the West, Deep South, and Appalachia, in addition to the Caribbean, in this turn of the century moment. And about 20 hours into the storyline, I was really struck by, well, that the game often gestured toward the big historical dilemmas that professional scholars have spent generations studying. Right? Things like the women's suffrage movement and its regional contours within the US, especially as it plays out in the South. Um, Warfare between native peoples and the US military, the sort of military dynamics of settler colonialism, questions of black rights in the South in the 1890s, right? A really crucial decade in Southern history that so many progressive era historians have studied. I mean, the list goes on, right? Corporate capitalisms, the railroad, mining. My colleague was right. It's not a stupid game. I mean, yes, it's way too violent, right? Like the levels of violence are ridiculous compared to what actually happened. And yes, the main character is a white man, and you see things through his perspective, but a lot of the people around him are way more diverse, right? Like this game is not a monochromatic John Wayne fantasy of the Wild West. It's a lot more gritty and it's a lot more thoughtful. I mean, to me, I see it more inspired by sort of the new Western history of, Patty Limerick and Richard White than it is, Frederick Jackson Turner or anything like that. So either way, playing this game, and the big idea that hits me is like, I know how incredibly popular this game is with college age Americans. Why not try teaching a class that uses the fictional content of the game, but then uses that as the hook to then draw students into a broader discussion of capitalism, race, empire, power, politics, political economy, the stuff that professional historians foreground in this period. And I was really surprised that no historian had tried exactly that before. I thought I was late in the getting on the train late, right? I mean, the game had been out for several years already. And I remember very well in 2020 going on my library database and looking up the kind of journals that serve American history, professional journals, and just typing the words in Red Dead Redemption, and almost nothing came up. As it turns out, 1 year later, the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era would publish an article on Red Dead Redemption 2, which is quite excellent. But it hadn't yet come out, right? It was in the pipeline. So I was like, wow, it's like crickets from the professional historians on this game that was incredibly popular. I mean, that millions upon millions of folks were playing, not just in the US, but around the world. So I had this idea, right? I'm going to teach a class on it. And it turns out that, lots of other professors have used the game in the classroom, but no one had tried to teach a class solely built around this game. So that went live in late 2021. Fall semester of 21 was my very first iteration of this class. Red Dead America, I called it. The real history behind the hit video games. And the class was really fun to teach. It was also very well enrolled, and that is for certain. Part of it was boosted by a lot of online publicity that I was fortunate enough to receive, both in the gaming press and in the kind of more traditional scholarly academic world. So that got word out at my university, right? That there was like a GameSpot story about the class that got a lot of students here in the know. So we really, the size of the class was significantly higher than previously. So the class was a ton of fun, and once I finished the semester, I was sitting on this pile of work that I and the students had done, right? I'd written lectures, I'd spent a lot of time in the library during the pandemic, right? Hunting down the books that could help me explore, scholarly monographs that would help me explore the big topics in the game and help me lecture from them. So I was sitting on all this work and I wondered, well, I've poured all this time into this course, why not write a book inspired by the class? Because I knew, the interest in this idea of using a fictional video game to explore history, it was not only limited to students at the University of Tennessee. Like I knew that there were potentially large audiences around the world, and certainly in the US, that might be interested in this. So I got to work writing a book. And that's what's coming out in August, August 6th. Red Dead's History, a video game, an obsession, and America's violent past. And with this book, I really wanted to aim it for non-specialists, right? I really wanted to aim at those gamers and the history buffs out there who might love the game, but are curious to kind of scratch that itch of, well, what can it really tell us about American history? And I'm really proud of the book. I think it kind of captures the highlights of the class, and I'm really eager to see it out into the world. And I see this, as part of this kind of larger public project of public history, as a way to kind of communicate the wealth and richness of academic scholarship, but to repackage it and make it accessible and engaging to people who might not otherwise pick up, a book by a professional historian. So that's a very long answer, Michael. I'm sorry for rambling, but it's kind of a long story, so I got to tell it so it makes sense.
No, I completely agree, and I really appreciate it. Like, it's every book is a long time coming, and so this one has a very unique story, I think, and so I'm glad to hear it as opposed to just reading it. But I wanted to touch on one thing that you mentioned, which is the classroom. Um,
Yeah.
uh, what was the reaction of your students to a class based around a video game, and how did participation differ from other survey classes you've taught?
Yeah, right. I mean, I think the students coming in on that first day in August of 2021, they really didn't know what to expect, right? Like some of them were probably dreaming that this was like a Red Dead fan club that they could just kind of, float by on their knowledge of the lore of the game. They would be deeply disappointed if they were expecting that because this was a serious class that had all the sort of hallmark components regular history classes, right? There's papers, we read primary and secondary sources, there's lectures, there's exams, all the same sort of stuff. And you know, I did not expect students to have played the game. I knew many of them would, but I never examined them on the fictional content of the game, right? There's no multiple choice questions. That's like, which of the following is a member of the Vanderland gang, right? Hosea Matthews, Charles Smith. You know, yeah, I'm not doing that, right? That's silly. That's, you know, it's fictional work. Um, so the game could really only provide enthusiasm for the students. It's not going to get them into A, B, or even C territory, right? They have to actually learn the serious American history to get there. But I did use the games a good bit, right? Whenever I gave a lecture, let's say on the Ku Klux Klan in the postbellum American South, I used the game, right? I used footage from the game. Usually I would embed YouTube videos in my PowerPoint shows, but sometimes when I couldn't get videos on YouTube, we would just play the game in class, right? I'd fire it up on my laptop, play for 5 minutes. Like I couldn't find any videos on YouTube that tried to explore this fictional city of Saint Denis, which is the game's biggest city. It's clearly supposed to be New Orleans in 1899. I couldn't find any videos online that explore the city looking for signs of racial segregation, right? Like visual markers of it. Turns out there's no YouTube streamers who are interested in that question, but I, as a historian, was very interested. So I pick up the controller and, you know, walk around for 4 or 5 minutes. And the students love that. Like whenever I played in class, they really enjoyed it. And actually, that gets to a kindred question, you know, what the students were expecting. I bet many of them weren't sure that I'd even play the game, right? They might be imagining that I'm, you know, had heard about it and I was going to use that as a hook, but I think they were pleasantly surprised to learn that not only was I a gamer, but I had really poured quite a bit of time and knew this game fairly well. Of course, I knew the history a lot better, but I was not ignorant about the nuances of the video game, so they wanted to know that. Um, but yeah, so they didn't quite know what to expect. But you know, and I think I probably had about 5% drop on that first day, you know. But most of them were really eager to be along for the ride, right? Like they were like, okay, sure, let's do this. And the levels, you know, you ask about the levels of engagement and enthusiasm. I mean, it's really hard to compare this class with other courses that I've done. Whether it's certainly survey classes, right? Survey classes where students are there checking a box. I mean, I work my hardest to get them excited, but it is an uphill battle, right? And in several of my other upper division classes, I mean, I like to think that I'm able to, you know, get them quite fired up about thinking about food history, U.S. Mexican history, things that I've taught previously. But there's no denying that the levels of engagement and passion that the students brought to the table was really incomparable. And it wasn't just that they wanted to talk about the games, right? Like, and I would keep that stuff to a minimum, you know, if they want to steer into the game talk. Most of the time, they were just excited to talk about, you know, serious stuff, right? Like, where does Jim Crow segregation come from? How is it created? Why is it created? What did the so-called Indian Wars look like? What was the ecological underpinnings behind them? Um, that's the kind of stuff they were like fired up to talk about. And I really hadn't expected it to be so pronounced. But the thing is, you know, using the game as a hook, the emotional sort of attachment that students have to this, I think it goes beyond other forms of pop culture, like movies, TV shows, books. It's just with a game, they spend so much time with it, and it's because it's interactive. They feel like it's their character. It's like their engagement with that world. So I think that this is video games are a particularly immersive form of pop culture that I think can have really powerful emotional, you know, connections in the classroom.
I I completely agree. Like the game takes about. I think I looked on one of the IGN. Is that the one? The website?
Yeah.
Uh, it said it takes 150 hours or 45 hours to complete the mission, like the central line, and then 200 hours to completely complete the game.
It's an investment of time. The first time I finished it, it took me 75 hours, and I did most things. I've played it 3 times total at this point. But yeah, it's not a lighthearted investment. You know, like it's much more than watching just a season of a show, or certainly like a movie, right? It takes a lot of your life. I mean, it's fun, of course. It's a very entertaining video game, but it's again, it's not stupid. Like there are so many hooks within it that you can pull on, so many threads that you can pull on, and really tell some pretty big historical narratives with it.
Yeah, and the thing about, I think, with an RPG like this, a role-playing game, it's you are immersed into it. You create your own character, you mold your own character to kind of play off what you want it to look like, you want it to do, and how you want it to interact with other people. And so I completely understand like students being much more engaged. Um, so but in the first, I think in your first chapter about the Old West, you mention Frederick Jackson Turner, and you mentioned
Yeah.
that he's not in the credits, but that he should be. How does the game play off of Turner's thesis?
Yeah, so Turner's thesis, of course, is, this two-sided argument, right? That the West has fundamentally shaped the American character in this recurring cycles of taming land, as he called it, free land, but that the frontier had closed by 1890. And that, Turner's kind of anxious about what the future of the American character and the nation, the national project, what they look like in the aftermath of that. And Red Dead 2 is fundamentally a game about the so-called closing of the frontier. And it's very nostalgic about that, and it's very anxious about it too. It sees the sort of pre-1890s West as this place of unbounded possibility, and sees that disappearing, right, as kind of corporate order and hierarchy and social inequality come to the West. And so the sort of the outlaws who are, remorseless killers in many ways are also heroes, or at least anti-heroes in the game, because they're nobly resisting this sort of arrival of the corporate modern order. So in that sense, you see a lot of Turner in the game. It really draws off of that idea of this fading, closing, taming of the West, which, of course, professional historians since the 1980s have shown to be totally bogus. Like, that's not the story of the West. There are not two halves of Western history, right? I mean, I think Patty Limerick told it best in The Legacy of Conquest back in the 1980s, that we have this uninterrupted story of conquest of mainly Eastern powers that shapes Western history, and that does not stop in 1890. That continues throughout. And so that's, of course, one of the big historical, professional historians' critiques of Turner. But the other big critique of Turner is that it's really just an English-speaking white man's story, right? That it's very ethnocentric, that it excludes native peoples, obviously, that it excludes the other competing European empires, whether French or Spanish, that it excludes women, African Americans. But in that sense, Red Dead 2 does not recycle Turner, because the game is not a triumphalist story of white men, quote unquote, winning the West, as Teddy Roosevelt put it. It's really a story of theft, of corruption, of betrayal, of corporate, power over kind of steamrolling more egalitarian ways of seeing the world previously. And in that sense, it really does dovetail more with a sort of new Western history of the last 30, 40 years, in that it's a story about kind of organized Eastern money and its impacts in the West. But what's interesting too is that the game is not just a Western. It always gets pigeonholed as such in that genre, that narrative. But a lot of the game, again, it plays out in the South and in Appalachia, where Turner was much less interested in, to be sure. But so yeah, there's some Turner, but it doesn't recycle the very worst of Turner. But it nevertheless is shaped by that idea that the West is coming to an end, that this wild period is being smoothed out.
Yeah, but yeah, I also completely agree with that. But but the big problem with the game that you mentioned is the temporal problems. It takes place in 1899, but the things that it talks about are not always taking place in 1899. Things like the KKK appear, even though they wouldn't have existed in 1899. So does this make the game less useful as a vehicle to teach history?
Thinking about this as a vehicle to teach history, I would never claim that this game alone is going to teach you the nuances of American history, right? It is not an educational tool. It is an entertainment product through and through, and on its own, it is woefully incomplete. However, with some accompaniment, whether in a class or in a book like mine, I do think it has tremendous potential to serve as a sort of, appetizer to the full meal of what professional historians can provide, right? By drawing on that kind of the plot line and the characters and so on and so forth. So yeah, so I joke often about that synchronicity and the kind of timing of it. I joke often that Red Dead 2 is a pretty great game about 1871. It's just set like 30 years later in 1899. And you might think, oh, well, 30 years, that's not that important. Well, any historian of late 19th and early 20th century America knows that there's actually a huge difference between those moments in time. So yeah, so lots of the topics that the game broaches, like open violent warfare between native peoples and the US Army. That was very much going on in 1871, really was not happening in 1899. I mean, the sort of military contest was largely over by that point. The Klan, right? The Klan is really in remission. It's kind of hidden underground, if not almost completely gone. Of course, it reappears soon thereafter. Um, the Pinkertons, for example, right? The Pinkertons are presented as like outlaw hunters extraordinaire, right? That's their primary thing that they're doing in 1899. Well, they're really busting heads at labor rallies in the labor movement by that point. They're really more of an urban industrial creature than they are hunting outlaws. So the game is off by about 30 years, but that doesn't mean that it's useless, that it's you can't make use of it in the classroom. You just have to think about all that as you're teaching, right? But in that sense, it gives me the opportunity not just to talk about the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, but also about Reconstruction, right? About the immediate aftermath of the Civil War in the South, which is another topic of towering significance to historians for good reason, and something that's, by a lot of regular Americans, very flimsy understanding of this, despite the fact that it so profoundly shapes the world we live in today.
I want to touch on that in a minute, but the book often uses very small moments in the game to explain enormous concepts in American history. Like, for instance, you already mentioned women's suffrage in the South, but you also have a whole chapter on chain gangs, which are mentioned only briefly, but take up again a whole chapter. You even get into the impact of political violence on populism at one point. How did you decide what to expound upon, and what was your method to extract the history from Red Dead Redemption?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. Right, so there's some moments that are really front and center in the game. Like this, there's this famous mission when Arthur Morgan, the protagonist, accompanies and assists women suffragists in the Deep South as they lead a protest march. Like that is a main storyline mission. Like you cannot avoid it. But then there are things that are kind of more on the sides. Like you see chain gang convicts across, only really in the South, but you see them kind of on the landscape as you're walking around. I guess when you free John Marston, your gangmate from this penitentiary, you see a lot of folks, but it's not. It's kind of like side mission content primarily. But still, I knew that a lot of students who'd sunk time into the game, they were well aware of this, right? Because the game has this addictive, sort of obsessive quality to it. And it's a very well-made video game, to be sure. And it encourages players to dig deeper and dive into things. So in that sense, the chain gangs would probably be quite memorable to a lot of the students who had played. But basically, I made these decisions in the summer of 2021 when I was drafting the class. I was, sitting down trying to make a syllabus. Like, okay, what are the topics that the game gestures toward that I can then thread out and do much more with? And I should say, there's so many more that I could have done. Like my book has 20 chapters, like 20 core kind of concepts, topics that could provide a sort of tightly bounded lecture originally and then chapter. But there's so many things that I didn't even have the opportunity to talk about, like US imperialism in the kind of 1898, 1899 moment, which the game does give you the opportunity to talk about. There's conversations around the campfire by the gang about the Philippines, which is really interesting. Then the gang winds up in a nation that probably was inspired by Cuba in some regard. And you see the sort of impact of an American robber baron like Leviticus Cornwall, this kind of fictional, Rockefeller or Carnegie from the game, who's also owns these sugar plantations in Cuba or Guarma, the fake island in the game. So I could have done so much more, right? This book could have been twice as long in many ways because there's so many other topics that the game gestures toward, doesn't usually flesh out, but at least kind of points toward that I could have done a lot with. And so I think ultimately it had to do with what I knew the best. Um, and what's interesting is that I'm primarily trained as a U.S. Southern historian. I taught myself a lot of Western history to write this book. I mean, I knew a lot of it from comps and things like this, but I needed a refresher on many topics. But the South had always been kind of my intellectual home. It's what my first book was primarily about, and it's what I trained in the most. And indeed, if it wasn't for the game moving into the South, like when I started playing it, I thought it was a Western, right? Because everyone says it's a Western, and then suddenly you're in the Deep South and you're in this fictional New Orleans, and I thought, wow, I do know a good deal about this stuff. This is something I can do, because I had this sort of inferiority complex at first that, oh, I'm not primarily a Western historian. I can get by, but it's not really my thing. And then suddenly we're in the Deep South, and then we're in Appalachia, right? Another place that I happen to know a lot about, in part because I live here. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, like even to build on that, like your chapters on Jim Crow and lynching, you talk about how the game often alludes to anti-black violence, but doesn't tackle the issue like it does the robber barons or the lost cause. So why do you
Right.
think that is, and how could the game do more to help players understand racial tensions in Jim Crow?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that Red Dead 2, which came out in 2018, so before Black Lives Matter really, reshuffled kind of corporate America's engagement with race and inequality. I think this was a pretty brave game for Rockstar, the developer, to make, in that it really doesn't shy away from questions of inequality and racism that were so pervasive, of course, in the late 19th century. And it includes lots of really nuanced and thoughtful black characters in the gang and that you meet elsewhere. So the game is quite interested in, acknowledging the first that America is diverse in this period, and B, that there's a lot of discrimination and exploitation taking place. However, there's still the developers undoubtedly were wary of controversy, right? They didn't want to go all the way. Like for example, there's no Confederate battle flags shown in the game, even though there's these like crazy lost causers all over the game, but they just don't include that. And of course, if we were to be totally historically accurate, if you went to a place like Mississippi in 1899, you would see the battle flag. It had just recently been put as the state flag a few years earlier. So I think they sidestep certain topics in Southern history that were definitive, right? Lynching, like they don't explicitly showcase a lynching, which is probably a good thing, right? Like that's a very, very difficult thing to do respectfully on a digital screen, especially in a game where there's so much player choice, right? They have to walk very carefully. So they stayed away from the most painful and difficult topics, and I understand why, but they still kind of gesture toward it enough that there were enough moments that I could use in the game to delve into some of the most, controversial and difficult subjects in Southern history, but the most important ones. I mean, you cannot understand the turn of the century South if you don't understand this kind of strange nexus of politics, Jim Crow, sex, and sexuality. There's that's defining this period.
Talking about the South and all this, how does the game depict the Civil War and the Lost Cause? How does it teach these complex issues, or at least attempt to teach?
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting. In the Western parts of the game, the characters that you meet there don't seem very concerned about history. Like no one's looking backward in the West. They're all looking forward. They're kind of dreaming of, the riches and wealth and settlements to come. But once the gang enters the South, they realize that folks there are haunted by the past. And I like how the game really shows that the Civil War and Reconstruction are very much on the minds of people still 30 years later, right? So there's these abandoned battlefields that you come across in the game. There's Confederate veterans on the streets, many, amputees who are begging. Then there's this rival gang that you encounter and often, get into firefights with, the Lemoyne Raiders, who are these sorts of unreconstructed, redeemers in many ways, the kind of folks who are resisting Reconstruction. They still wear the gray uniforms of the Confederacy. They, wax nostalgic about fighting the U.S. Army at that point. So, and there's statues all over the place too, which is really important. That the game portrays the ways that there's this kind of cult of memory that's seeking to glorify and romanticize the Civil War and the role of the Confederacy in it, presenting it as a noble sort of fight. But the game doesn't recycle the Lost Cause. I mean, the game is critical of the Lost Cause, the classic moment where you can see this is that there's this huge equestrian statue of this Confederate general in the middle of Saint Denis, this fictional city, and scrawled on the statue is the word coward. Right? That there's someone here who's like calling BS on the myth of the Lost Cause, and there's lots of other moments too when the game really critiques that kind of mythological cult that's coming into being right at that very moment of the 1890s. But of course, the game doesn't get it totally right either, right? The classic example that I use is that these Confederate statues that are very visible in the big town and smaller towns of Red Dead 2 is that the statues look old. They look like they've been around since the Civil War. And as historians of the Lost Cause know, that's not actually true. They should have been fresh. They should have been very sparkling new because they were most likely put up in the middle or late 1890s and would not have, seen decades of weathering and, wear and tear from being out in the elements because the Lost Cause only really goes big and goes public in the 1890s, not in, during Reconstruction or anything like that. So, yeah, I mean, I think the game provides, again, on its own, it's totally incomplete. Like, gamers would be scratching their heads to figure out how all this connected. But for me, as someone who's, quite well read in that period, it was fairly easy to pull on the fictional elements of the game and then tell that story of, well, what is the Lost Cause and where does it come from? And how can the game reveal some of that?
It's interesting because like the game does have a lot of different groups fundraising and trying to rebuild stuff in the South, especially in Saint
Yeah.
Denis. But it'd been interesting if they had someone from like the United Daughters of the Confederacy trying to fundraise for a new statue or to clean something. Again, I'm not a video game creator, but
Yeah, well, it gets at this question too, like what kind of research did Rockstar Games do to write this game? And I do not know the answer to that question, right? I mean, they're very secretive about their creative process, which I respect. I understand, they're very good at what they do and very successful at it. So I don't know, like, did they consult monographs by historians? Did they have PhDs working for them? I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know if we ever will know it. But I also don't know that it really matters because they clearly did some homework, right? They certainly must have studied photographs and visual relics of this period because they really do a nice job of nailing the sort of aesthetics of, either New Orleans or kind of these small, boom mining towns in the West. They get those pretty nicely. Um, but the social and cultural fabric of human life, that's hard. You don't get that from a picture, right? That requires a lot deeper reading. And I think they did some of it, but clearly not all of it. I mean, again, it's not an edutainment title. It is an entertainment title. Like it's clearly made for fun and for commercial use. So it's unfair, in my opinion, to expect, kind of peer-reviewed scholarly work out of it. That's just not what this thing is. I mean, I ultimately think that historians should be fortunate that the game exists. I think if the game didn't exist, we would be worse historically as a nation. I mean, people might argue with me on that, but I think that it ultimately does more harm, I mean, more good than harm. I mean, it needs accompaniment, but it opens a sort of window. Like it doesn't guide you through the window, but it opens it and lets people like me and others, I'm sure to follow, um, help explore the real world that the game depicts.
So I was going to ask you that how has there been a reaction from Rockstar about your research or your book or any emails?
No, I've had no contact with them at all, which is just fine. They're very they do their own thing. So this is totally an unauthorized product. I have no relationship with them whatsoever. However, I do have a relationship with many of the actors who played key roles in the game. And the one thing that I'm really excited about is that the audiobook version of Red Dead's history is being narrated by Roger Clark. And Roger is best known for playing the protagonist of Red Dead Redemption 2, Arthur Morgan. And I do have the audiobook. It arrived about 2 weeks ago. I've listened to all 11 hours of it, and it is so good. Roger does an incredible job with it, and he narrates it in character as, who he played in the game. So listeners, the fans of the game will immediately recognize his iconic voice. And I have to tell you, it still sends chills down my spine to hear the voice of Arthur Morgan reading this book that I wrote. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And the actors have really, the actors are independent contractors, right? They're not Rockstar employees. But they have been very enthusiastic about this project ever since it was a class. I mean, I've had actors reach out to me. I just met a ton of them this past weekend. I was in South Dakota for a Red Dead Redemption convention and got to meet about 20 members of the cast. So they've been big supporters from the beginning, and I'm just so honored and thankful that Roger accepted our invitation to serve as the audiobook narrator. And I hope that this will really bring the book, make the book even more accessible and engaging to gamers. I think having this partnership with him is one of my key sort of aces in my deck when it comes to the public history, the kind of public-facing engagement with this. So I'm very thankful for it.
Yeah, he does have a very like interesting voice and captivating voice, and I think that would be. I'm not saying it'd be better than reading your magnificent prose oneself. However, I'm sure that
Would
would
would you like
definitely add
would you
something.
like to hear a sample of it, Michael?
I mean, if we can.
Let me. Oh, I can't share my screen. I'd have to share my audio, but I could play it briefly, just so you could hear what it sounds like. Yeah, I think you might. I think listeners might enjoy the teaser of this.
Chapter 5 Guns, Gunslingers, and Violence. It's a familiar scene, both in Hollywood classics and the Red Dead Redemption games. With the setting sun as backdrop, we enter a bustling saloon on a dusty street in a one-horse frontier town.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. But it sounds pretty amazing, right?
It does. It's very exciting.
Yeah, and so Roger is also, I mean, before doing this game, he's a very, decorated and acclaimed actor who's also read many, many audiobooks before, who's done many history audiobooks. So this was not his first rodeo, but it was the first time that he's, narrated a book about the game that made him so renowned, which is quite funny.
I mean, yeah, I'm sure it's very exciting and exciting for you and your publisher.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because yes, I'm a historian, but I'm also a little bit of a fanboy when it comes to Red Dead Redemption 2. Remember, I just picked up this game for fun. And again, as a video game, it's very enjoyable. It's very entertaining. And I do think that the acting is really top notch. I mean, I see this game as sort of like an interactive HBO show, right? In terms of the quality of the writing and the acting. So yeah, so for me to be able to hang out with the actors who play Arthur Morgan and Dutch Vanderland and Sadie Adler and all these folks. That's pretty fun for me personally. I could never have expected that any of this would happen. when I first came up with the idea of teaching the class. Right? This is like beyond my wildest imagination.
Yeah, no, I that's really exciting. So to get back to something that we've talked about a lot, it's about context, and this whole book is to place the game in context. So not to put you out of a job or anything, but how could video games add the context to be more historically accurate, or should they even add the context to be more historically accurate?
Yeah, I think the obsession with accuracy, which you can find all over the internet and the kind of gaming world, I don't know if it's the best thing to focus on because games that are really historically accurate are not fun, right? Like it's just most of the moments that we dramatize in history were not fun to live through. Like they were incredibly grueling, painful, and difficult. So accuracy can often if you go lean too hard into accuracy, you'll lose much of your audience, right? And there are, of course, games that are much more accurate than Red Dead 2, but they have much smaller fan bases, right? They really appeal to a very small minority of the gaming world. What I care more about is historical thoughtfulness. Like to me, that is much more important. Things that doesn't have to get everything right, but that it wrestles with those kind of the core defining issues that shape people's lives at the time, right? So like Red Dead 2, for one, right? This sort of burgeoning power of corporate capitalism. Like that was the political topic that everyone was fighting about in the late 19th century. And I think the game does a fairly decent job of getting at that. I mean, certain things are totally absent in the game, like the labor movement, right? Like incredibly important topic partisan politics. Like the game does not have partisan politics, even though like even outlaws in 1899 would have probably very strong partisan affiliations. And I wonder, I think Arthur Morgan would be a populist personally, but who knows, right? Uh, so those things are totally absent in the game, or almost entirely absent. But nevertheless, it still is thoughtful in the ways that it shows how this new breed of entrepreneurs, of business owners, were transforming the United States through these empires that people like, Vanderbilt and Rockefeller and Jay Cook and others were building, right? The Leviticus Cornwall figure of the game kind of gets at that nicely in some ways. So, the accuracy, thoughtfulness, a little bit of both would be nice, but how can developers do more of that? Well, they need to hire historians, right? And again, I don't know if Rockstar did this, but there's a lot of really brilliant, underemployed historians in the world today, right? People who have history PhDs who are facing the incredibly grim nature of the academic job market. Why don't those folks go to work, consulting for studios to make games? It's a win-win, right? It provides employment and stability for trained experts, and it finally gives developers and writers of games the ability to get at that historical thoughtfulness because you can't just get this stuff on Wikipedia, right? It takes years of training to have that knowledge and that worldview to understand to let games not just look historically right, but to get at that social and cultural fabric that shaped people's lives. So I really am hopeful that, as games continue to grow in size and prominence, because of course they're not a fad, they're not going away. Like they are here to stay for good and ill, to be sure. Let's make more opportunity for professional historians, people with PhDs, to be involved in that world, right? Like I would love to see more of that. It's already happening to an extent, but I want to see it become common practice for studios to hire these folks, right? Because like just because you can code doesn't mean that you can make a historical game. You need the humanities. Without the humanities, this entire venture is hollow.
I mean, as a grad student, I completely agree, but we'll see. But on that same note, like you said Red Dead Redemption 2 is not the only historical video game. It's one of the most popular for sure, but there's other video games like Assassin's Creed, which also places itself in a fictionalized historical world, but at the same time, it kind of takes place in the present. And then there's Civilization, which was like that was probably one of my first video games where you get to
Right.
be a country and grow
Yeah.
your country and go to war. But it takes place partly in history, but then it's mostly fictionalized because you're changing every time. How are video games teaching history?
Well, not always very well, let's be honest, because a lot of the kind of canon of historical video games have been very narrow in that they're often these kind of big world building games. Not only are they sometimes quite pro-imperialist, but some of them are really Eurocentric, right? That they really see the world from a sort of, white Western perspective, and the rest, they don't, they're enemies or opponents. They're not like people you can play themselves. So there's been a lot of problems, right? I mean, video games get a bad rap, especially in the scholarly world, and partially for good reason, right? I mean, the video game industry has really struggled with a lack of diversity of perspectives, right? That young white men have so predominated in both who makes and who plays games. But that is something that is really changing. I mean, especially since the pandemic, the range of people who play games and serious games is really expanding quite greatly. So this is not the world that that I first saw in the late 90s when I started playing games, right? That was a very male and pale and young world, right? And that's, I mean, they're still there, but there's a lot more going on. So developers are beginning to speak to those. But no, I mean, so games like Assassin's Creed are quite interesting because now I've only played a few of these games, and I can't speak to them as historical recreations, in part because there's never been an Assassin's Creed game about the modern United States, and that's the only thing that I'm actually trained to speak as an expert about. So, like I played their game about ninth century Baghdad, and I found it interesting, but I don't know anything about ninth century Baghdad, so I can't really weigh in here. But what distinguishes the Assassin's Creed games from the Red Dead games is that very often the Assassin's Creed games actually use the names of real places and people, like they call it Baghdad. They don't call it, like Red Dead Redemption doesn't call it New Orleans. They call it Saint Denis, and as a result, they get much more free reign in kind of how they depict the place. So in that sense, the Assassin's Creed is more accurate, but not always. Like calling a place by its original name doesn't necessarily make it a better or more accurate game. You can fictionalize and still tell really rich stories that are historically thoughtful. So I don't know. I mean, I think the main impact that historical games have had is in getting people excited about history, not necessarily teaching them all that much, but getting them passionate about it. And I bet if you poll an average American history major, like the folks who pledged a major, I bet a good quarter of them, maybe even a third of them, would be in that major because historical video games got them passionate and excited about studying it. I could certainly say that that's true at my own university. So it's bringing a lot of people to our major, and I think we need to be critical of the problems with those games that are leading students to us, but I think we also need to we shouldn't dismiss gaming entirely as just like a waste of time, as this, because it's providing us with a lot of majors. And, as historians, we can't turn all that many majors away. We need them, right? We all know the sort of decline in majors nationally over the last 20, 25 years. And so I think it's important to, not embrace the games that brought them here, but to at least know a little something about them so that we can use that even more effectively to retain and grow the number of majors that we have, right? That does not mean pandering to them. Like, I'm not into pandering. I don't want to provide familiar content that affirms what they already know. And I mean, I really hope that my book and my class on Red Dead really, teach gamer students things that they never had considered before, right? That it really blows apart their understanding. I mean, for example, I don't even believe the Wild West is a thing. Like, it's kind of an invention. So it's not like I mean, I meet them where they are, but then I take them to a very different place. And to me, that's not pandering.
Right. Yeah, it's similar to like historical fiction. A lot of people got into history through
Oh
historical
yeah,
fiction or even popular history, which is not always 100% accurate or uses the same sources as scholarly history, but it still brings people into the world of scholarly history and helps
right.
academics
I mean,
learn more and sell more books.
historians have been using pop culture to get students and readers excited about the past for a long time, right? Whether it's films, TV shows, literature, you name it. It's just that video games have been kind of the black sheep of the pop culture family that many of us have been reluctant to go there, in part because we don't play ourselves or because we have negative associations with it. Maybe that had been made, 20 years ago. And I think it's an important moment now to rethink some of that, skepticism toward just gaming in general. Like, there's plenty of games we should be skeptical of and critical of. Um, but to dismiss the entire genre as having no utility in what we do, I'm I'm critic. I think we need to do much more with it. And this is a sort of experiment born out of that view.
I mean, on that note, the final part of your book is pretty critical of the game's depiction of Appalachia. Uh,
Yeah, it's
what
pretty
does the
weak.
what does the game get wrong here that it gets right in its depictions of the West and the South?
Yeah, well, so in the West and the Deep South, the game largely resists the stereotypes of, that have been so often recycled of that period. It does not paint the South as moonlight and magnolias. It does not bring in Gone with the Wind style romanticization. It resists that. But then when we get to Appalachia, when we get to the southern mountains, which in the game are captured in this sort of Roanoke Ridge, Butcher Hollow area, it drags from the vault nearly every tired stereotype of Appalachia, right? Of the sort of shoeless, long-bearded, antiquated mountain man with the corncob pipe, that's isolated from the modern world, who's detached from modernity, the kind of deliverance view of Appalachian history. And so you have that in the game, and I spent a good bit of time in my book critiquing that and also showing why it's wrong. And in fact, the game saves itself at the last minute by also providing an alternate Appalachia, kind of buried below the surface, because the game does showcase the way that this region was not at all isolated in 1899, but it was deeply embedded in American corporate capitalism through the logging industry, through the mining industry, through the railroads, that indeed this region is being conquered by Wall Street, just like the West was in the same time period, and that's actually what caused this poverty and insecurity, not just this timeless detachment from the currents of American civilization. So the game, it presents this weird two-sided face of Appalachia. Like on one hand, that very cliched view of this isolated, trapped in amber place, but then also one that's very much in the grips of industrial America and very much for the worse of Appalachia. So, in one hand, it's the weakest depictions and representations in the game, but then it does save itself at the end by allowing me to also tell the story of, well, what's actually causing, poverty in Appalachia, and that haunts us to the very present day.
Yeah, completely. So I have two more questions. Before I get to the last one, I kind of want to ask you. So in one of the first side missions of the game's protagonist, Arthur Morgan, actually meets a historian, a biographer of Jim Boy Calloway, who asks Arthur to
Right.
conduct oral interviews, former gunslingers. What do you think of the game's depiction of historians?
Michael, I totally forgot about that mission. I forgot that is he an academic historian, or is he just kind of like, a guy who does this for fun?
He's a biographer, so it doesn't get any beyond that. But he's interviewing, trying to get stuff from Jim Boy Calloway, who's drunk, and then Arthur Morgan is sent to literally conduct oral interviews. But then he like shoots half of them.
Or all of them. Um, this is another question that I could have another chapter on in the book. I really haven't even thought about it. I wish you would have raised this like 2 years ago. Uh, yeah, it's true. There are some historians. I mean, I think they're kind of portrayed comically as these, deluded, de kind of detached from reality people. And let's be honest, some of us probably are that once in a while. But yeah, I'd need to think on that more. I do not have a canned answer for you on that one at all.
That's all right. This is what happens when I play the game right before
Yeah,
I
well,
ask
we
questions.
need more smart, thoughtful people playing the game, right?
Apparently. Uh, so my final question, you mentioned in the epilogue what you hope for in the next Red Dead Redemption game. I was wondering if you could expand on that and your hope for historical video games yet to come and games in academia.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much potential. The future, if it's done right, is very, very bright for the marriage of thoughtful, serious history and playful digital games. And so, yeah, my hope is that there is a third Red Dead Redemption. I would be shocked in part if there wasn't, just because it's been so tremendously successful of a franchise for Rockstar. It'll be a while, to be sure. Um, but yeah, so my vision for Red Dead 3 is one that goes further back into time, because the evolution of the series so far has been backward, right? That we go from 1911 in the first game to 1899 in the second. So given that Rockstar clearly wants to make a game about the 1870s based on the topics they cover in Red Dead 2, why not actually set it in the early 1870s? Because that's a moment, of course, when the future of the West is much less certain than it is in 1899. I mean, by 1899, the sort of bloodshed of the Indian Wars has largely come to an end, uh, and the corporate conquest of the West is largely accomplished, if not entirely. But in 1871, like no one knew what was going to happen, right? There's so much contingency and possibility with the power of native nations, with the sort of frailty and weakness of corporations. You know, the Transcontinental Railroad had only been finished a few years prior, and it was a complete mess. So there's lots of possibility in narrating Western history if you set it in the early 1870s. But I also really would love to see a third game that moves into the South and explores that in the midst of Reconstruction. I mean, that's hard to do because it's a very, fraught subject. Um, but I think with the right people and the right attitude, you can make a really interesting game that explores the political violence and racial violence of the South in the midst of Reconstruction in, let's say, 1871, right? Like a year when the Klan very much still did exist, and lots of freed people and their allies are fighting them. I mean, this game likes showcasing, violence and bloodshed. Well, there was plenty of it in this period. It's just deeply political violence that's about racial democracy and whether it had a future in the United States. So I'd love to see a game done right in the early 1870s. But as for other games, I think Red Dead Redemption series is going to be a pioneer and a leader because they're proving, especially if a third grade game is really thoughtful, they're proving to the wider gaming community that you can make diverse, thoughtful games and also make a lot of money, right? Because I think to convince other developers to begin trying to do this, you have to show that it's commercially viable. And Red Dead 2, um, as being, what fascinates me is that it's in the top 10 best-selling games ever. It's the seventh best-selling video game of all time. And it's literally the only historically themed game on that top 10. Everything else is, fictional, fantasy kind of stuff. Um, so they are leading the way in showing that you can make a historically interesting game that's also makes a lot of money. So we'll see. I mean, I don't know. I'm eager to, 10, 20 years from now, what's the state of history in gaming? I'm really curious to know. I bet virtual reality will be a big part of it. VR, when it's done right, is very viscerally emotional and gripping. I haven't used VR that much, but what I have done is pretty interesting. But harnessing that and using it to teach serious history, I mean, the potential is kind of endless.
I mean, it reminds me of the Simpsons episode where Lisa puts on the virtual reality helmet and there's Genghis Khan and saying you'll hang out with who I hang out and eat who I eat, and but there's always a future, and I think that's an optimistic note to end on. So I want to.
Yeah, and there's a future, but it would be a much brighter future if we, aka professional historians, right, are involved in shaping it. Like if we let just the, Silicon Valley pave the way, it's gonna be underwhelming in terms of representing the the nuance and contingency and complexity of the past. So I hope that this book also stands as my sort of like vision and manifesto for historians getting really involved in this world. Of course, there are many already who are doing this work. I'm not the first by any means, but I think we need to be more public facing in a lot of the work that we do. Because I hope that there's eager audiences. We'll see. Maybe the book will be a total flop, but I'm hopeful that it might find some readers.
I'm hopeful that we will find some more jobs in video games for historians. Again, as a graduate student, that is what I'm aiming for, is some sort of job.
Yeah,
And
right.
so thank you so much, Tori, for coming on the podcast, and thank you for this book. I'm really excited. I think this comes out the day after its release, so congratulations and good luck.
Thanks. It's been such a pleasure to be on the show, and thanks for your really thoughtful and insightful questions. And I hope that you can finish Red Dead 2 fairly soon.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.